Hello everyone, Ruby Ravel here, a celestial twin of heavens with my sibling sister residing below the earth. And yet every other day we swap places so that I go to the underworld and she rises up to the zenith of the heavens. One of us is good, the other is evil. But we look so identical in appearance that only by the tenor and quality of our actions can you tell which Ruby Ravel is which. And I begin with this preamble today because we are talking about Mercury in Gemini, the sign that governs duality and the creative friction between pairs of opposites. There is a wonderful novel by the Italian writer Italo Calvino called The Cloven Viscount, which is about a Viscount who heads out to the Crusades, where in the first charge he receives a cannonball to the chest, which instead of obliterating him to smithereens, which is what you would expect to happen, instead, much like a cartoon, separates him perfectly down the middle. And instead of dying, both of those halves go off their separate ways and live as dualized individuals. One half becomes completely evil, brooding, malicious, and malevolent because he experiences the pain and suffering of being only half a being. He feels the need to get this compulsive revenge on the rest of reality. He is envious and judgmental of the wholeness of all the other beings that he experiences. So he goes around chopping everything in half, from people to flowers to, well, anything you name it, just generally being as much of a villainous bastard as he can possibly be. But then the other half does completely the opposite. This is the good half, the good twin. And because this twin experiences the pain and suffering of being only half a thing, instead of hating the world for it, it teaches it love and compassion. It says, I know what it is to feel lack. I know what it is to feel incomplete. And I know that on some level, even all these other people out there who are apparently whole also feel this suffering too. So to counteract the holy, malevolent actions of his brother, he instead goes around being very compassionate and loving and moralistic. So what this teaches us in relation to the sign of Gemini is that we are more than the singularity and totality of what we appear to be. We are comprised of different parts that can harmonize and counteract with one another, but which can also conflict and appear to be pulling in different directions. It represents a state of awareness at which we become aware of the dualized, complex nature of things. In the two preceding signs of the zodiac, things are pretty simple and straightforward in terms of how we identify, perceive, and experience the world. With Aries, everything is seen through the lens of the ego, through the I am, through the I want, through the desire nature, and the power that comes from having the capacity to make your will be enacted in the world. Taurus experiences the world through the lens of its senses. It says what I can taste, what I can feel, what gives me pleasure. These are the things that make the world real and which make my relations to it possible. But Gemini approaches the world from the mind. And you've got to remember that even the mind, which we associate with the physical organism of our brain, is inherently dualized. We don't have just one uniform cerebral cortex. We have those two separate hemispheres of the brain. So there is a sense in which duality is built into the very nature of what it means to be human, to be left and right, to be black and white, to be light, to be darkness, to be yin, to be yang. These things are hardwired into the matrix of the human experience. So it is deepening the awareness of what some of the black and whiteness of our nature can be. With Aries, it's a case that You want something and you want it with your whole being, and you dedicate all your energy to going after the things that you want. There's no grey area there. Your want is the totality of your experience and relationship with life. Then with Taurus, if you eat a piece of cake, you either like it or you don't. There's not much room left for ambiguity because you're coming from your senses. And either your senses say, good tasty cake, or they go, bleh, ugh, nasty cake, and spit it out. But once we come to Gemini and we start approaching things not with our power and ego and not with our senses, but approach them with our mind, the mind has a way of deconstructing things. In order to understand things mentally and intellectually, we take them apart. And one of the quickest ways that we can take something apart is to split it in half and see what it looks like on the inside. So to go back to the novel The Cloven Viscount, I feel like one of the points Italo Calvino is making there is that a man is not just one thing, but he's a synthesis of contradictory elements that don't always make sense and which often seem to be counterbalancing one another. That we can look at a man as a whole human being and we can see that within his actions there is an inconsistibility, there is a mutability, there is a changeability, that what he says and what he does is not always the same, that there isn't a strict, rigorous moral or philosophical or electronic code that he was always governed by, but that he is always being influenced and affected by his moods and his circumstances and all of the other variables that are taking place at any given time. You can see that sometimes this man makes good choices, makes ones that are selfless and considerate and good for the group, and you can see that other times he does things that are stupid and self-defeating and hurtful and harmful to other people. And this is approaching it from a very simplistic point of view, but you could look at such a person in that light and say, it's almost like there's two people within this man. So let's play this thought experiment of separating him down the middle and having one wholly good and having one wholly bad, and then going on with this alchemical experiment of seeing the purity of both sides so that we can more fully comprehend what is happening when we are experiencing the contradictory perfection of relating to that whole. And so when we talk about Gemini as being the twins of the mind, one heavenly and one underworldly, we are dealing with the fact that man is not just what he is also the combination of his different possibilities, that he represents not just the physical organism that he is or the expression of his will, that within him represents the ongoing choice of what he chooses to do or not do in every moment, and that every choice he makes is in some way a commitment to one version of him, and any other choices he makes are also a commitment to a different version of him. But then also with every choice that he makes, he's not only solidifying the person who he apparently is, he's also solidifying the shadow who represents the antithesis of everything that he is not, and yet which equally is just as an important part of his being because it defines who he is. So this is one of the reasons that Mercury in Gemini has such a reputation for being a very fast and energetic thinker and speaker, is because whenever it is apprehending anything with its mind, or its tongue, which is basically constantly, it is always looking at the possibility and the potentiality that everything represents. It's not just enough to look at something and see what it's doing now, which is what happens when we apprehend it with our senses. We're also considering all the possible things that it could do with the very essence of what it is. So to again engage in a different thought experiment, if we talk about those three different signs apprehending a car, and Aries sees a car and it says, oh, that's a powerful, strong car, it's driving that way, I would like to drive that car. Taurus might see the car and go, that car is pretty, it's red, it's beautiful, it has these certain external features, it costs this much, so I'm assuming that the driver who owns it must have a job of this or that status in order to be able to afford such a beautiful, luxurious vehicle. Whereas when Gemini looks at the car, he's not just interested in where the vehicle is going or what it looks like. He's thinking about all the possible different places that it could go, but he's also going to deconstruct the car mentally and ask, well, what makes a car a car? What makes it drive the way it does? What makes it work? What are all the different component parts that are assembled together that make that car function as it is? What would happen if you rearranged those parts? Could we construct a better car from that? Could we construct a more interesting one? Could we take it apart and put it back together again as a totally different vehicle? It is playing with the logical reality of a thing as though it were a game, and using that as a vehicle for creative expression and understanding, because it wants to find the factual core of what makes a thing a thing. It doesn't just want to experience it and have a relationship with it, it wants to understand it. And if it needs to talk a lot or write a lot or communicate endlessly to do that, it's because even just by looking at something very simple, the range of possibilities and potentialities and rearrangements and reconstructions that it contains is basically infinite. And when you're having to comprehend all of those things singularly within your organism, it helps if you have someone to listen to, because then that person can act as a patsy or a test dummy in which you can explore all those different ideas and narrow them down. If you are manifesting as one twin, you need someone else to be the receptive twin who can help you explore these ideas, so that through their feedback you can understand which are factual, which are useful, which are worth pursuing, and which ones are just needless dross that we can chop away. And gradually, through the support and the back and forth of that other person, we can chop and narrow things down until we have come to some kind of logical conclusion or deduction. But again, if Mercury in Gemini is represented by the twins, it's because we can also engage in that process with ourselves. It's the fact that a lot of the time when we are engaging in deep analytical thought, we are having a conversation with ourselves, because it is easier for the brain to work if it has some kind of significant other, whether real or imagined, that it can bounce these ideas off of. You know, I'm sure many of us, while we're working around and we're testing an idea, we have imaginary conversations in which we imagine discussing this idea with someone else, and we imagine how they would respond. So there is the logical imagination is a big part of how Mercury in Gemini works, as well as giving us glorious Freudian slips like this. But if we backtrack and we think about how Mercury in Taurus works in comparison, Mercury in Taurus is known for being a slow but also possibly deep thinker, because when Mercury in Taurus thinks about something, whatever it's thinking about, it wants to have a practical outcome. It doesn't think about things just for the sake of it, because they are interesting, because they inspire its curiosity. It thinks about things because it has an impact on its real world life. And therefore, if something you're thinking about is going to change the way your world manifests and expresses itself out there, which you are interacting with in your senses, and that is your prime relationship with the world, then it is going to be very important for you that any decision you do make with your mind is the right one, because you don't want to manifest the wrong world. You don't want to manifest something that is either incorrect or unpleasant to your senses. So if you're thinking over something, some logical problem or decision, you're going to mull over it slowly and deeply and methodically and piece by piece, just to make sure you are absolutely committed and convinced on any idea before you then say, yes, this is right and this is true, and I'm now going to start manifesting in action. It's very important. Whereas Mercury in Gemini is not engaging with things inherently from a place of practicality. It doesn't really care if any of its ideas have a real-world application, because the beauty and the excitement and the curiosity of an idea is nourishing and sustaining and entertaining enough in its own right. The friction, the buzz, the excitement of when your neurons are working and asking questions that it feels have never been asked before is a pleasure in of itself, is a sort of satisfaction in and of itself that does not have any need to be related to the physical world out there. Because Mercury and Gemini doesn't live in a strictly physical world, because, unless you're some kind of mad, malevolent, barbarous Sweeney Todd type surgeon, you can't go around chopping things in half like the Cloven Viscount does. But with our mind, we can chop anything in half. We can take anything and play with it and pull it around and take it apart. That's what I, as an astrologer, do. I have Mercury in Virgo rather than Gemini, but, someone hands me a chart that is the symbolic personification of their soul, of their mind, of who they are. And through the interaction of all those different symbols, I can put apart all of the different planetary and astrological possibilities of what those symbols represent, and then deduce which ones are most likely to apply to that person. I don't do it purely that way. There's a lot of intuition that's going along. But for Mercury and Gemini, it's taking the data and playing with it until you have a picture that in some way makes sense, that has some kind of order and innate symmetry to it. So by chopping things up with the mind and reducing them to their component parts, Mercury in Gemini feels like it can understand things better, because then it can see the underlying patterns and the underlying details of what makes a thing function as it does. Again, to use an astrological metaphor, if I'm just meeting someone off the bat and experiencing the contradictions and the messiness of some of their real-world experienced lived human behavior, I might be a bit confused. But if I can then separate a person into their Sun, their Mars, their rising sign, their Venus, their Mercury, their Uranus, their Neptune, the different distribution of all their houses and what have you, I have then deconstructed a person and then reassembled them in a way that makes the whole that I am experiencing more manageable. Because when we're just experiencing the enormity of sensory data that we're receiving from one person, it can be very overwhelming, it can be very confusing. So Gemini, by cutting things up and saying these things are the important and the rest is just noise, the rest is just static, it's engaging in this alchemical process of trying to distill something down to the basic essences of what it is and then putting it back together again so it can understand it. And this is where the intellectual side of it is practical, because if it has understood something, then logically it should know how to interact with it better, because it has seen the internal mechanisms whereby it functions. But it is the fact that Mercury in Gemini is interested in exploring ideas for their own sake, rather than to make practical applications in the world, that can sometimes confuse people and make them misleading. Because a Gemini, in order to understand an idea, to see whether it's true or not, to see whether it's really valuable and corresponds to what it thinks and feels, will try on a whole multitude of different ideas, just as some people will try on different clothes. Taurus will go to the changing room and say, yes, I like this dress, it makes me feel pretty and beautiful. Oh, I don't like this dress, it makes me feel frumpy, it's unflattering, I don't like the way the texture goes against my skin, I don't like the way it looks in the mirror. Gemini tries on ideas in the same way. It says, well, to some extent, to see whether an idea is worthwhile or not, you have to experience it. So it may express all kinds of weird or wacky ideas or concepts in the moment to see how other people receive and respond to them. And from that, it can derive some idea of the worth of that idea. It doesn't mean it actually believes in that idea, that it's committed to it. It's just trying it on. Everything's for play. Everything's for show. Everything is part of the ongoing experiment and flirtation that it has with life. But to someone who thinks that all language and communication should be based solidly on fact, when Gemini then comes along the next day and tries a different idea that seems to cancel out the one from before, it can feel, oh, where did that come from? That's a contradiction, or is that a deceit, or is that a lie? Why are they saying one thing and then saying another? They don't understand that Mercury and Gemini is exploring ideas and trying them on and playing intellectual dress-up and in intellectual tourism. It's not committing to an idea as a factual thing, but as something that is part of the cerebral playtime of reality. And if people don't know this, and particularly if a Mercury and Gemini person might even not necessarily be aware of that's what they're doing, it can be very confusing to be on the receiving end of. One famous example of this would be Richard Nixon, who had Pluto rather than Mercury in Gemini at his midheaven. And as the 10th house, midheaven, governs what our legacies tend to be, what we tend to be remembered for, he's obviously remembered for being tricky dicky, for being a liar, for being evasive, for engaging in equivocation, for saying things that were deviating from the truth. And the people and the aides who worked under him while he was a president often had a confusing time, that when he was in the mode of kind of firing off presidential dictates, he might say, oh, go out and do this and go out and do that and then do this and then do that. And then later on change his mind, or make it understood that actually in those moments when he was saying do this, do that, he was just testing out ideas. They weren't real things to be enacted upon. And so his aides, after one of these meetings, would sometimes have to come back and kind of be like, what were the real orders and which were just the pretend playful ones that we were trying out? Because I honestly don't know. And then many times they didn't even want to ask him that question because they didn't want to fuck around and piss off the president. So they just went, okay, well, he probably didn't mean that order, so we're not going to execute that one, but we like that other order more, so we will execute that one. So the lack of clarity from Gemini sometimes can be confusing because, as with Libra as well, Gemini struggles to commit or choose or decide to pick just one idea over another because it's in love with possibility. And the moment you choose to commit to one thing and not to another, the moment you choose to commit to one twin and not another, there is a certain possibility, there is a certain proportion of infinity that you have denied, that you have killed, that you have cast down to the underworld to be unlived. And there is a part of that is infuriating to the Gemini experience because it wants to know everything. It always wants more data, but because there's an infinite amount of data, it can never run out. And so to pick one thing means to kill all the other possibilities of the other things that it could have picked. And so it's not unusual sometimes for Mercury and Gemini to decide one thing, maybe even to begin to go ahead and do it, and then halfway through to get cold feet and go, oh no, actually I want to try the other thing. Because that idea that it could be missing out on something, that it could be missing out on the potential insight or the excitement that a particular idea or experience could be giving it, is horrible. And that's why it is comfortable most existing in the mind and existing in the realm of chatter, because in the realm of chatter and communication and just shooting out and playing with ideas for the heck of it, you never really have to commit. You can constantly change your mind, because the mind in and of itself is infinite and always prone to changing course. It does not always have to be solidified. You can just play in it and masturbate intellectually constantly. No one's going to stop you unless they shoot you or take your fucking brain out in a lobotomy. Now, the character of Mercury and Gemini is nicely represented by the mythology we have over Mercury Hermes himself. When Mercury was first born as a child of Zeus and Maya, he was very quick in developing. No sooner had he been born than he was running about, playing with everything, making inventions and causing havoc. One of the first things he did on being born was seeing Apollo's cattle and saying, oh, those look nice. I'm going to steal them and take them for my own. And then I'm going to take the hide from that and transform them into new instruments. And he made the panpipes, and he made the lyre, and he made all kinds of things. So again, that's a symbol for how the mind and the nimbleness of Mercury and Gemini can take someone else's idea or can take something that is pre-existing in the world and then through its cunning ability to rearrange things, turn it into something new that the original creator or the original creator or the original thinker wouldn't have been able to do because of that heightened awareness of the different possibilities of things. It can quickly shapeshift anything to suit whatever cause or purpose it has. But that also includes the ability to shapeshift or manipulate or equivocate the truth to suit whatever situation it's in. So even though Mercury comes alive and then steals Apollo's cattle, stealing some of the possessions of the gods, which is, a capital offense, on the list of bad things you can do, that's pretty high up there. And so when Apollo finds out that this youngling, this new god, this son of Zeus, has stolen his cattle, he's infuriated. So he captures Mercury, he takes him to Mount Olympus and says, "Zeus, your son has stolen my cattle." And Hermes, at that point, Mercury, whatever you want to call him, he basically says, "But how could I have done that? I'm just a tiny little baby. I've just been born. How could a pathetic, helpless little baby like me have stolen all of that strong, buff Apollonian cattle?" So he understands that he can distort reality to favor his own aims and impressions of this. And this is also a symbol of the flexibility and the mutability of the mind, that the mind is impossible to be trapped or pinned down. It can always reimagine and shapeshift itself to get out of any situation. And Mercury and Gemini people often possess this knack as well, in that even if they might have this impulsive tendency to say, "Yes, I'm excited by this idea," and throw themselves out into it totally, if they later change their mind and have to backtrack, they can usually find very logical and reasonable ideas for doing so that make it sound as though that were part of its plan all along, and that if you let them get away with it, then you would be being very reasonable and sensible too. They're very good at manipulating facts and data so that it works in their favor. And this is exactly what happens in the story of the birth of Mercury, that Jupiter and Zeus is so impressed by his son's ability to just lie with complete barefaced confidence that he's like, "You know what? I like you. You can join us up here on Olympus. But you can also go back to Earth. You can be the messenger of the gods, the one who moves back and forth freely between these two realms, just as the mind acts as an interface between that kind of Platonic realm of ideals that we inhabit in our head and then the practical real world of the senses that we operate out there now." Mercury can see things out there, make deductions about them, and then recreate them in a practical way, which is why Mercury in Gemini also has a reputation for being good at craftsmanship, as well as being a good writer. And so much of writing is taking other people's ideas and distorting them so that they now look like your own, or taking the basic archetypes and elements of a given theory or mode of thinking or a different particular pattern of storytelling and then rearranging it so that it works with you. It's taking the rules of something which you have deduced factually and logically and then playing with them to bring something new and creative into the world. And this is what Mercury does in the story when he takes the cattle of Apollo and he creates the lyre, the world's first instrument, out of it. And when Apollo hears the lyre for the first time, he is so impressed by what Mercury has done with his ingenuity, which he never would have thought to do given 1,000,000 years. He would have just always seen his cattle as cattle. The fact that Mercury saw his cattle and said, "I can make a musical instrument out of this," is fucking genius. And so, again, Mercury in Gemini has that capacity to look at different things and think, I could make something new out of this. So Gemini and people can be good craftsmen. They can be good mechanics and engineers, people who are good at finding the component parts of things and saying, yes, now that I've got these, that I've got these Lego bricks of possibility, here's what I'm going to make them into. Because even though he's playing with reality, he's still approaching reality from a logical place. He's not just making impossible things. He's kind of saying, okay, what is possible in the world? And how can I push the envelope of that possibility in a new way that is fresh and exciting and creative, and which will make more freedom and openness graspable to the human experience? Because Gemini is also associated with horses, and almost all of the divine twin gods that we know from the past were associated with horses. And this is because horses, as one of man's first vehicle that we could either ride alone or attach to a chariot or other constructed mechanism, rapidly increased the amount of the world that we were able to see. Instead of just being bound, doing everything slowly on hand and foot, we now had horses that had so much more stamina and endurance and speed, and could take us places in a much shorter space of time than if we had to do it on foot. It made the world a bigger place, a more accessible place, but it also made the world a quicker place. And a quick world and a constantly exciting world is the one that Mercury and Gemini likes. And if nothing interesting is happening, then it will ask the right questions and take things apart in the right way to make them more interesting. And again, to go back to the Cloven Viscount, that's what happens in Italo Calvino's novel. Before the Viscount gets split in half, he just lives like any other noble nobleman. But the moment you chop him in half, suddenly the whole world is thrown into chaos, but very exciting chaos that is full of potentiality and full of the philosophical depth of what it means to be a thinking, inquisitive human being. So even if Mercury in Gemini has little scruple about using its cunning and its craftiness and its ability to shapeshift to slip out of any tight spot it might get stuck into, ultimately we let it get away with it for a lot of the time, because Mercury in Gemini makes the world more fun. It thinks up all the things that a lot of us don't have the imagination or brain power to think of. It keeps things constantly buzzing and lively when so many of the rest of us are just happy to be mundane or just to go through the motions. It is the one that refuses to allow life just to be one solid static thing all the time, but which is addicted to the excitement of change. And if you are addicted to change, then you learn to make change happen in an engaging way. You learn how to press and prod things so that they keep on moving, so that the chariot of the horse carries on pounding into the future, and that you're not just stuck in one human settlement forever. Gradually you make that world bigger and bigger and bigger, and your own mind bigger, because it is the lens through which you are perceiving and experiencing that world. Anyway, that's enough for now. Hope you enjoyed that mercurial presentation. I'll let you guess which Ruby Revels you saw. Did you see the good twin? Did you see the evil twin? Did you see a different twin in every frame? Who knows? I don't. Chop me in half and maybe you'll find out. Anyway, if any of you want to talk about your own inner contradictions or your own Gemini mercurial experiences and placements, feel free to comment below or to contact me at thestarsunraveled@outlook.com. You can follow me on astrology and underwear if you want to look at pictures of me in underwear, because why not? And then you can support me on Patreon at www.patreon.com/thestarsunraveled.